Okay. I actually got this to work. Oh my goodness. Oh. So, Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine. You're the first, so I'm excited because I did something right.
Yes,
Pardon me. I'm very pregnant and due in about, I don't know, 9 days and counting or something. And
I
so
saw in the email. Congratulations.
thanks. So I'm gonna venture to try and empty my bladder early before we get started. So I'll be right back.
Okay.
Oh, wow. Lots of people need to be admitted now. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome, one and all. Thank you so much for logging on early. Let me know if I need to make you co-presenters, if I need to right click and, make it possible for you to be able to share your screen.
It looks like I can share my screen. Maybe I could just practice right now and see if it works.
Okay.
Hit the button just to see. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All good.
Um,
I'm going to actually follow you, Laura, and try to practice sharing my screen as well. All right. And you all are seeing our cover page?
yes.
Great.
Nice.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, how you doing?
Hey, I am so not tech savvy, so I'm kind of impressed with myself having figured this out.
It's been our life for the past year.
Well, I have been on maternity leave for the past semester. So at UConn, we get the entire semester off.
You didn't have to use it last last spring of 2020.
Yeah, and I'm on sabbatical in the fall, so I feel like I have less experience than a lot of folks that have been, working with Zoom and other platforms. And our university discourages us from using Zoom.
Do you use Teams,
A
right?
lot of Zoom bombing occur.
Do you use Teams?
They just turned us on to Teams, but so they turned us on to Teams during this semester that I'm off.
Well, I just learned to use that like 2 days ago because I'm teaching in the prison and the state of Connecticut only uses Teams. So I was like, I have to learn a new system. I was so thrown off by it, but I got it and I succeeded in teaching last night, but I felt very off my game.
I hear people rave about Teams. We were using, what was it called? Something that's akin to Blackboard that is, right now it escapes me what we even.
Canvas or something?
It escapes me what we even call it right now, but it is part of our Husky CT kind of Blackboard system. Yeah, it escapes me because I haven't been using it. It escapes me right now what we actually call it. And then with my son, it's been Google Classroom, which sucks. That's not a great platform. Yeah, it escapes me right now with let me see, WebEx. That's what it's called, WebEx.
Yeah.
You use WebEx or something else. WebEx is more conducive to a graduate seminar. And then there's another platform.
So just to make sure you're up on this, do you know how to share your screen, Evelyn, so that you can, if Laurel and I have like a little PowerPoint, do you know how to do that to make us co-hosts?
She just did a trial run.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm late to the party.
A few people just kind of like threw theirs up there.
Great.
So I guess upon entry. Oh, I got 2 more people in the waiting room. So let me add them.
Yeah, I think it's already enabled, so you can just click and I can see my screen. So
that's great. Makes my job easier. I ducked into an earlier panel because I was the topic of a paper. And it's so weird. It makes you feel like listening to your obituary or something like, am I that old? It's like, wait a minute. First off, am I that old? Should I be 6 feet under right now as you're talking about, my contributions and stuff? It just feels so weird. Like, am I really that old? And honestly, I spoke to somebody yesterday and they were like, you're pregnant? I mean, do you mind me asking, how old are you? I was like, look, I'm asking myself the same question. When people ask me how I feel, I feel like I could go into labor any day. That's how I feel. I mean, literally, that's how I feel.
to what number will this be for you? What child?
Number 3. And this was a oops. This was a, you think it can, you kind of take for granted. You think at this age it can't happen. And the stars align. You thinking, I tell people, I'm closer to 50 than I am 40. So I say, I told my doctor, y'all better snip me because we can't afford this happen again. Daycare alone is almost 3 G's when you got 2 of them. In Connecticut, anyway, it's nearly 3 G's.
Wow. Well, yeah. And how old is your How old are your other two?
My son is 11, so he's actually very helpful. And the other one is 23 months.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, no, that's not too, that's good space still, 23 months. You know, it's about 2 years.
I was just talking this morning about you to my husband, and I was saying, I think I went to go visit her after she had the baby, but the baby was like old enough. She was able to get in like a, you know, like a thing where she could move around, like stand up in it, right? And I was like, when was that? Like with the pandemic, I can't keep track of anything. I said, I don't know how old she is. I think maybe she's 18 months, but it feels like it's a time warp, you know, but.
Yeah, she's 23 months.
Wow.
And maybe a week or two, something like that.
So she's almost 2. That's
Yeah.
Well, she'll be able to help too.
Yeah, well, if she's not jealous, she's pretty spoiled and she's pretty diva. You know, she's extra. She a bit much. You know, she's a little queen bee. So I think she's gonna be jealous. My son, on the other hand, is more the merrier. You know. We got about a few more minutes.
Well, it's good to see the panelists. I don't think I've met everyone on the panel, and I mean, I've probably heard of you, or I haven't met, so it's good to be on the panel.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you.
Agreed. Oh,
Nice to meet you all too. This is actually my first NCOPES. It's my 3rd year in the PhD program, but my first NCOPE. So sucks that it's virtual, but still happy to see you all.
Nice
Well,
to meet you too.
welcome.
And I think, Michael, I think you sent somebody my way. Something like maybe about my research about Somali Americans in the Twin Cities or something.
Oh yeah, I think it was a reporter, and she was asking me a lot about Ilhan Omar, and I was like, well, I can send you to someone who really knows what she does. You know,
Well, I was touched. I was like, oh, it's nice to know that he knows what I've like, that I've done some work, you know?
Yeah. So hopefully it wasn't a big inconvenience for you to.
No, I think it took me like 10 minutes. So yeah, but anyway, thank you. That was nice of you.
Yeah, it's hard to get in contact with her. I tried to reach out. I mean, it's hard during election season to get any member to come to a class and a pandemic. So, but she's just hard to get in contact with, period.
Yep. Yeah, I had access early, you know, before she was elected, when she was a city council staffer, and I know her sister well, but I can't break out and reach out to her anymore. She's like, you know, I mean, for understandable reasons, it has like a lot of, she's busy, and then she's got security, and then according to one of her close friends, she changes her phone number all the time because people get it and then they start harassing her. So it's tough.
Wow. Yeah.
Hi, everybody.
hello.
Hey, Sharon.
Hey, I sent you a private message, Sharon, but I see that both of you all have advanced net labs. Did you get my private message? No? No, okay.
I do have a quick question. If anyone has attended other panels, how are folks like myself indicating sort of time is up?
I just type a private chat to the person.
Okay.
And sometimes like people just have to, you know, butt in and cut them off. Like I saw Valerie, you were handling that panel yesterday.
I felt so bad though, because you know, it was so much good information, but you know, some people get a little long-winded.
Yeah, you should feel free to jump in and just, it might even be easier than the chat. Just say 1 more minute or something. I won't be offended if you interrupt.
Me either. Yeah.
Yeah, I even tried clearing my throat, and that wasn't even working.
So I'm gonna give folks like another minute, but because we've got, I think, a total of 4 presentations, I want to start early, sooner rather than later, so everybody has due time to present. So I'll give folks like 1 more minute to join.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Hey, Lori.
Morning.
Actually, it's afternoon for me.
Afternoon, everybody.
Still got 30 minutes before it's afternoon.
Oh man, I have some people on here I haven't seen in forever. Stephen, what's going on?
Hey, Lori, how are you?
Good. Wow.
It's like a family reunion.
It is. Hey, Michael.
Evelyn.
Hello.
Did they say where it's going to be next year at the meeting? Because I had to leave early last night.
Baltimore, DC.
Oh, good.
Wow.
All right.
Hey, Valerie. Tyson. Kenisha.
Hello, everyone.
Okay, everyone. It is 12:32, and I'm gonna start by way of introduction. Each of the panelists have been instructed they have somewhere between 10 to 15 minutes, which allows for 15 minutes of Q&A, at least a minimum of that, as long as everyone adheres to that time frame. So welcome. I'm going to keep my eye on the waiting room and continue to admit folks as they keep trickling in. But I'm going to kick off with a short, brief introduction. And our first presentation will come from Sharon Wright Austin at the University of Florida. But first things first, welcome. The title of our panel is Historic First in U.S. Elections. My name is Evelyn Simeon. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Connecticut. I will serve as both your chair and discussant, but I'll admit up front, I'm not going to be discussing these respective chapters so that we can have some Q&A from the audience. So I'll kick off with sort of a short background introduction because each featured panelist has contributed a chapter to an edited book by the same name title of this panel, Historic First in U.S. Elections. It builds upon my previous monograph by the title, Historic First, How Symbolic Empowerment Changes U.S. Politics. And that concept of symbolic empowerment is sort of the thread, the construct that weaves these respective projects together. And so I've argued that the historic entry of Black candidates have changed the nature of American presidential elections. The main idea is that the presence of a historic first who mirrors a marginalized group signals greater access to electoral opportunities and at the same time motivates political behavior. This is described in terms of contextual effects that are symbolically empowering. Building upon this monograph by way of extension, the proposed panel examines history making first in US elections across various types of office and constituent groups. In particular, the panelists consider how recent breakthrough elections are similar yet different from past historic elections, insofar as they effectively mobilize historically underrepresented groups, namely women and minorities across race and ethnicity. When candidates who look like themselves run for mayoral, gubernatorial, and congressional office, the cumulative effect of their multiple identities specific to both the individual and their campaigns will be shown to stoke the desire to vote and participate, as well as propose substantive policy once the candidate is elected to office. Now more than ever, in light of the 2020 American president election, as well as clearly the runoffs in the state of Georgia, research on the mobilization of voters is relevant to discussions about electoral outcomes and political representation. That said, the potential for symbolic empowerment to have continued relevance today across electoral office and constituent group merits our scholarly attention. And I've got more to admit. So without further ado, we'll kick things off from Sharon Wright Austin, who will talk about the gubernatorial race of Andrew Gilliam. Then we will segue into our congressional races involving Omar and Tlaib. Those presentations will be made, delivered by Stephanie Chambers of Trinity College and Laurel Elder, speaking on Omar, and Michael Minta from the University of Minnesota will speak to Tlaib from Detroit. And we will end with our mayoral case, Mayor London Breed of San Francisco, and that will be presented by Lori Frazier, Crystal Robertson, and Chelsea Jones, all from UCLA. So without further ado, Sharon, if you'd like to kick things off.
Okay, thank you. Oh, first of all, thank you all for coming, and thank you also to Evelyn for inviting us to be a part of her edited book. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, I hope you can see that. All right, let me try to. All right, so in 2018, Andrew Gillum ran for governor of Florida, and so that's what the chapter that I'm writing in Evelyn's book deals with. So in 2018, not only did Andrew Gillum run for governor of Florida and only came to he lost by 0.4%, less than 1% of the vote. But there were also two others, Stacey Abrams. Let me see, somebody put something in the chat. Okay, all right. Thought it was for me. So Stacey Abrams also ran in Georgia, and I'm sure you're familiar with what happened with her there. She lost by approximately 2% of the vote. Ben Jealous also ran for governor of Maryland. So those were three African Americans running in statewide positions. And if you know anything about African American politics, which I'm sure we all do, then you know it's very difficult for African Americans to compete in statewide elections, and especially when they're running for governor. Very few African Americans have ever been elected as governor, but especially in Florida, because of the unique politics there and because of the political history, especially of Blacks, it seemed like at first that no one really took him seriously. And I'll talk a little bit about his background, but yet he almost won. So that's the question I'm looking at. How was that possible that a person who was an underdog, wasn't very well known in the state, running for a statewide position, ran and he lost, but lost by a very small margin, and he almost won. So I focus on the issues that he addressed in his deracialized campaign, the groups that provided him with the most support, and also the major challenges that he encountered when he was running for governor. So in the book, we're using the symbolic empowerment framework that Evelyn first mentioned in her first book, her book that was published in 2015 by Oxford University Press, Historic First, How Symbolic Empowerment Changes U.S. Politics. And so in that book, she analyzed and focused on four individuals: Shirley Chisholm, who ran for president in 1972, first African-American woman to seek a major party nomination; Jesse Jackson, who ran for president in 1984, 1988, Barack Obama, elected president 2008, reelected in 2012, and Hillary Clinton, who ran for president and also is probably best known for the 2016 campaign that she lost to Donald Trump. So she focused on them and looked at the influence, as she says on page 11 of her book, of a historic first, because that's what all of them were. And so the definition of what that is a candidate with the ability to become the first of his or her race, gender, or both in elective office. And so what impact does the presence of that person have on mobilizing people, especially people from marginalized racial, ethnic, and gender groups? So the argument that she made in her book is that these historic first candidates motivate voters who are usually less interested in voting and also in political campaigns in general, in particular with Barack Obama. He motivated a lot of people to vote for the first time, and in particular, he motivated a lot of African Americans. So that's the framework that all of us are using in our chapters. So in 2018, Andrew Gillum, a young man, he was only 30 years old, ran against a man who was a member of Congress by the name of Ron DeSantis, the person who is now our governor, who eventually defeated him. So Andrew Gillum, this Democrat, born in Miami from a working class background, he talked about his parents, he talked about the influence of his grandmother. He began his career really in politics as a scholar activist at FAMU. At the age of 23, he became the youngest person ever elected on the Tallahassee City Commission. And then later he became mayor of the city of Tallahassee. So he was a young, dynamic person. And then he decided to run for governor. And even though he was mayor of Tallahassee, he didn't really have a whole lot of name recognition outside of the city of Tallahassee. So he ran against Ron DeSantis, who was a Republican, who had a lot of money, who had the support of Donald Trump. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you saw this campaign commercial of the DeSantis campaign with him and his wife. It received, I guess, a lot of late night comedians made fun of it because he was talking about his love of Donald Trump, and his baby son was, they were reading Art of the Deal to his baby son. So, you know, that tells you just the kind of relationship that he had with President Trump. And it's now rumored that Ron DeSantis is planning to run for president in the upcoming election. I look at a lot of exit poll data in order to determine the demographics of who voted for both men, but in particular, who voted for Andrew Gillum. So one of the things that he was disadvantaged by, once he made it through the Democratic primary, he was this underdog. Nobody expected him to do well, but he ended up winning the Democratic primary, as I mentioned in the chapter, and he defeated some candidates that were a lot more funded than he was, including a woman named Gwen Graham that was the front runner. And everybody expected her to win because her father, Bob Graham, was once governor of Florida, and he also was once a U.S. senator. She had a whole lot of money, and all the other people who ran, many of them were millionaires. But Andrew Gillum used just a classic grassroots campaign in order to win. But there were some problems in the city of Tallahassee. It's a relatively small, I guess, urban city that has the problems of any other small or medium-sized urban city, especially in Leon County, where it's located, has one of the highest crime rates in the state. And so the DeSantis campaign was able to capitalize on these problems. But also even more troubling for Andrew Gillum was the fact that in June 2017, the FBI began a corruption investigation against the city. And he wasn't necessarily the target at first, but they did find after the election that he paid a fine because he accepted some tickets to see Hamilton, the Broadway play. He accepted a trip to Costa Rica and also a boat ride to the Statue of Liberty from a lobbyist, which he should have known better than to do. But he wasn't really being, I guess, investigated. The city of Tallahassee was, but this was something that was used to damage his character. And eventually he did pay this $5,000 fine after the election was over. If you know, and I don't mention this in the book, but if you know anything about Andrew Gillum, but he's had some other problems since then, as far as with his marriage. He was on the Tamron Hall show and some other issues that I don't really raise in the book. So as he became more popular after he won the Democratic primary, the media coverage of him increased. And so when the media focuses on you, they're bound to find something embarrassing in your background. And so they found all of these things. So that leads to the question of who exactly voted for Andrew Gillum when he ran in 2018. He put together, I guess, a progressive coalition that consisted largely of minority voters, African-American and Latino in particular, younger voters, especially between the ages of 18 and 29, female voters, and also more educated, more affluent voters. And so those were the people who traditionally vote for Democratic candidates in gubernatorial elections, and he was able to get support from them. But on the other hand, in Florida has 67 counties, and there are only probably about 12 or 13 that a Black candidate can realistically expect to win in a statewide campaign. And those are near like the urban cities. But, you know, most of the voters in Florida are white, The men vote at higher rates in Florida, white men in particular, older voters, rural voters, less educated voters, they tend to vote for Republican candidates. So he received 91% of support from Black men, 82% of support from Black women, 31% of the white male vote, 47% of support from white women, 49% from Hispanic men, and 58% from Hispanic women. So he had a really good coalition, and the turnout rates were really good as well. If the turnout had just been a little bit higher, he probably would have won. In terms of the education of the voters who supported him, most of the voters with a high school education or less preferred the Republican Ron DeSantis. He received the majority of support, approximately 57%, from people with advanced degrees. But there was an ideological split. He received 90% of the vote from people who consider themselves to be liberal, 61% of men and 62% of moderate women supported his campaign. 85% of conservatives supported Ron DeSantis. So there was a major ideological split. But even more so than that, there was this partisan divide. As we know in American politics, there's a partisan split. 90% of Republicans and Democrats, respectively, voted for the Republican and the Democratic candidate. But the good news about that for Andrew Gillum is that it wasn't a case in which maybe a lot of white Democrats didn't want to vote for a Black man. The majority of Democrats, regardless of what their race, they tended to support his campaign. So in terms of age, he did well among younger voters, especially between the ages of 18 to 29. You can read all this on your own. And the focus of the things that he focused on in his platform pretty much helped him in terms of getting support from younger voters. I remember when he came to visit our campus, he came there more than once, even on election day. He personally went to the polls with students and faculty from our university, traveled throughout the state, going to different colleges and universities, because those were the people that he really wanted to target. And also it was successful in the sense that he did well with that younger group of voters. And he wanted to put together a progressive coalition, and he was successful in doing that. But older voters tend to support Ron DeSantis, which isn't uncommon. The problem is that older voters tend to have a much higher turnout. And so unless you're a candidate like maybe a Barack Obama that could really motivate young people to turn out in really, really high numbers, you tend to be at a disadvantage in Florida. So in the interest of time, I know I'm running out of time. And I can answer more of your questions during the Q&A. But in terms of what can we learn from this, he used his deracialized campaign to overcome all of the disadvantages associated with him being a person who didn't have very much money, didn't have name recognition. And then we also have to mention the fact that he's an African-American man governing a medium-sized, a small city, and then attempting to govern the entire state of Florida. And that also brought about a lot of suspicion from a lot of people. Florida also has a history of electing Republican governors. They haven't elected a Democratic governor since 1998. So he had all of that going for him. I already mentioned the partisan divide. He couldn't really get a lot of support from Republican voters. So he had all of that to overcome. But nevertheless, if you read the entire paper, I talk about just his campaign and what he was able to accomplish. So what can we learn as far as for the implications for Black candidates running in gubernatorial and other types of statewide elections? Well, first of all, usually they have to have had at least one elective office, which he did have as mayor, but preferably at the state level. And that'll get you the kind of name recognition that you need to really attract people to vote for you. And usually, according to other research that I cite in the chapter, you have to have won the election that you had immediately before you ran for this office. And so he had won his mayor's election, but usually if he had just won some type, maybe statewide election, or maybe even a congressional election before running for governor, he might have had a better chance of winning. You have to have a deracialized campaign. Which he did. He didn't really talk about a lot of racial issues. And you also have to have the enthusiastic support of your party, which I can question of whether or not that was the case, because some people just didn't like the fact that he won the Democratic primary. So the party publicly supported him, but they didn't give him a lot of enthusiastic support. So he was qualified, but I guess the question is whether or not he'd had the kind of political preparation that he needed in order to run for governor. So I'll go ahead and just stop there in the interest of time.
Thank you so much, Sharon. You did a great job. And thank you for staying within that time frame. Next up, we're going to hear from Professor Stephanie Chambers from Trinity College and Laurel Elder from Hardwick College. They are going to comment on Representative Omar breaking barriers for Muslim, Somali American, and immigrant women.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for being here with us today, and a special thanks to Evelyn for putting together such an impressive volume with such impressive scholars. Really, we're really happy to be part of this. So just a little bit of background on our collaboration. So our interest developed partially because I wrote a book called Somalis in the Twin Cities in Columbus, Immigrant Incorporation in New Destinations. And so I had done a number of years of research on the Somali American community in the two cities where we see the largest number of Somali Americans in the nation, Columbus, Ohio, and then the Twin Cities. And in fact, that book is now being, it's a little bit on hold, but I'm working with a filmmaker in Los Angeles to make it into a documentary film that focuses on the Somali American experience in the Twin Cities. And then Laurel Elder is a scholar who has, a longstanding research record looking at gender, politics, partisanship, and her most recent book, which is coming out, you can pre-order it now with NYU Press, is The Partisan Gap: Why Democratic Women Get Elected, but Republican Women Don't. And so Laurel has this extensive research looking at gender and politics. And so the two of us came together and thought about writing a contribution to this book, dealing with Ilhan Omar's historic victory, because it fit nicely within the framework that Evelyn had put out in her initial book. And so jumping in, Ilhan Omar's 2018 congressional victory garnered tremendous national attention for breaking not just one, but multiple barriers. In January 2019, when she was sworn in as the US representative from the 5th Congressional District in Minnesota, Ilhan Omar, along with Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, became the first Muslim woman ever to serve in the US Congress. Omar also became the first member of Congress to wear a hijab on the floor of the House, a historic first that required the overturning of a 181-year ban on head coverings of any type in the House chamber. Omar was also the first Black woman and first woman of color to represent the state of Minnesota in the nation's capital. She was born in Somalia and personally experienced the US refugee resettlement process, and she remains one of very few first-generation immigrants serving in the 117th, 116th, when she was first elected, Congress, and the first ever African refugee to serve. Omar brings other underrepresented perspectives to her work in Congress as well. She was 36 years old when she entered Congress, more than 2 decades younger than most of her colleagues. She's also the mother of young children, which remains an uncommon experience among women in national legislatures today. She was also the first Somali American woman elected to a state legislative position. And she defeated, this is really quite impressive, she defeated a 22-term incumbent in 2016 to take that position in the state legislature, which is really a remarkable aspect of her political leadership trajectory. So our paper seeks to determine what factors explain Ilhan Omar's historic congressional victory. And what we try to do is shed light on how her distinctive experiences as a young hijab-wearing Black immigrant woman have shaped her leadership and affected her experience as a national elected official. So for the methodology in our chapter, we draw on multiple sources of data to answer these questions, including news coverage from the Twin Cities major newspapers from 2014 to 2020. We also analyzed Congresswoman Omar's newsletters to look at her priorities and policy positions. We look at the demographic and political information about her congressional district. And then we also did original in-depth interviews with Somali Americans living in the 5th Congressional District. And what we argue in our chapter is that a key ingredient of Omar's success was her ability to draw on the multiple path-breaking dimensions of her identity to assemble, inspire, and empower a diverse electoral coalition to become civically engaged. We also draw on scholarship exploring the intersection of women's representation and party polarization to place Omar's congressional victory in a broader context, arguing that her ability to influence legislation, similar to most women of color, is very much tied to the fate of the Democratic Party. Omar and her progressive colleagues also faced opposition from a Republican Party in Congress that has become even more dominated by white men over the past several election cycles. And her 2018 election is also framed by the rhetoric of former President Trump that was, sexist, racist, anti-immigrant, and she was running alongside that sort of rhetoric that was, quite condemning and polarizing for her and the other members of the squad that were ultimately elected. And we argue that Omar's political campaign and membership in Congress have sparked interest, civic engagement, and political confidence among marginalized communities in the US who, prior to Omar's election, had never seen someone who looked like them in the highest levels of political power. And so if we look at Omar and her 2016 state legislative election, she won a Democratic primary, as I mentioned before, running against a long-standing white liberal woman who had a 22-year, incumbency in the state legislature, Minnesota state legislature. And the film, if you've seen it, A Time for Ilmar, chronicles that election and really how Omar was able to break through. In 2018, she won the primary for the 5th congressional district in Minnesota over a more experienced competitor and in an open seat. Representative Omar and the other members of the squad all won re-election in 2020 as well, which is noteworthy. And also, I think everybody here knows that the squad has also further expanded. So we ended up, we had AOC, Ilhan, Rashida Tlaib, who will be covered in the next presentation, Ayanna Pressley, and then we now have Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman as part of the expanded squad, the new squad. In any case, they all won re-election in 2020. And I guess I'll turn to Laurel Elder for the second part of our presentation.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, once again, our main goal of this project was to find out how was Ilhan Omar able to defeat a more experienced competitors. As the last slide showed, several of the people she was running against actually had more experience than her. Some were able to raise more money than her. So how was she able to win this competitive 2018 Democratic primary, which in turn put her on a glide path to become a historic first in Congress? And as Stephanie mentioned, we argued that a key force behind this was symbolic empowerment, as developed, of course, by Evelyn Simeon in her 2015 book. So throughout the campaign, Omar argued that the historic nature of her candidacy and the fact that she embodied a perspective that was largely absent from Congress made her the best candidate to advocate for the issues affecting marginalized communities. And the interview and other data we collected supported the idea that this appeal was indeed effective in mobilizing a diverse winning coalition. So we argue that Omar drew on her experience as a first-generation immigrant living in Trump's America to mobilize the immigrant community. So this slide is showing that the demographics of the 5th Congressional District in Minnesota compared to Minnesota overall and the United States. And we see that 15% of Minnesota's 5th Congressional District is foreign-born. And I'll just show here, while Somalis only compose part of that total, the 5th District is in fact home to the largest Somali community in the US. And the interviews that Stephanie conducted with the Somali American community revealed that Omar's candidacy and emphasis on the value of immigrants in America, in American society really did resonate. Somali Americans spoke about how they're inspired by Omar and entered conventional politics for the first time to work on her campaign and to vote in the Democratic primary. Ilhan Omar was also able to speak authentically to Black Americans living in the 5th Congressional District, who form, as this chart shows, 17% of the district. So after being elected to the overwhelmingly white Minnesota State Legislature in 2016, she actually helped create the Minnesota House People of Color and Indigenous Caucus. She was vocal about systemic racism and criminal justice reform. She received key endorsements from Black Lives Matter, and this helped her to both mobilize and win the votes of the Black community in her district. Omar was also able to draw on her intersecting identities to mobilize young people, especially college students, women, and white progressives, which was key since the district, the 5th Congressional District in Minnesota is actually a majority white district. So the 5th Congressional District actually represents part of the University in Minnesota campus, and as a result, is one of the youngest congressional districts in the US. And as Stephanie pointed out, Omar was in fact younger than her competitors, and in her campaign, she emphasized experiences common among young Americans, such as her status as a renter and a young professional with college debt, to connect with and mobilize young voters. And while all the major candidates that she ran against in the Democratic primary were from the progressive wing of the party, Omar was able to secure key endorsements from progressive groups like Move On and Our Revolution, and also Women Winning, a powerful progressive women's PAC, which signaled to these groups that she was one of them. It's also worth noting what was not a key factor in her election, which was political party support. So of course, although parties don't have control over nominations in the US, parties can and increasingly have played an important role in recruiting and supporting candidates for office. Both the Republican and Democratic Party claim they're interested in supporting women candidates and diversifying their elected officials, but it's very clear party support was not how Omar got to Congress. Omar's first step into elective office came not as a result of recruitment by the party or biding her time or waiting her turn until there was a vacancy, but rather as a result of running against an established incumbent within her own party. And she won her congressional primary the same way, without rather than because of support from the Democratic Party. And this is similar to the route taken to power by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ayanna Pressley, who came to power by challenging long-term incumbents in their own party. And I'm going to conclude right here. So let me conclude by discussing just a couple broad points about the significance of Omar's victory. So the theory of symbolic empowerment not only helps explain Omar's political ascendance, but also illustrates the broader impact of her victory. Interviews with the Somali American community suggest that Omar's election to Congress may be continuing to inspire a new generation of young women and those who share aspects of her life story to become more politically engaged and consider running for office. And this is true not just in Minnesota, but across the country. Also, Omar's rise to power and potential influence must be understood through the lens of partisanship and party power. So Omar is now one of 50 now women of color serving in Congress since Kamala Harris became the vice president, and 45 of these women of color in Congress are Democrats. So when we look at Congress, there really is a stark divide. We see a diverse Democratic Party where women form close to 40% of Democrats and women of color are well represented, versus a Republican Party where women form less than 15% of the caucus, and there are only 5 Republican women of color, 4 of whom were elected in 2020. So it's also important to point out that the Democratic Party's return to majority status in the House in 2018 and their future hold on power is very much dependent on the strong performance of women candidates of color, such as Omar and the squad. And the opposite is also true. Omar's potential political power and potential influence is very much tied to the fate of the Democratic Party, and more specifically, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And I just conclude by saying right now, with unified democratic government, it's a rare window of opportunity for Omar and the squad to translate their symbolic representation into substantive policy.
Thank you. And I think that's really a great transition for Michael Minta from the University of Minnesota. He will be discussing another member of the squad, Rashida Tlaib, a symbol and champion for Detroit. Michael, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Evelyn. Let me try to share my screen here quickly. Let's see. Okay, then let's project it. Okay, thanks everyone for attending our panel. I had a lot of fun working on this project, and Rashida Tlaib obviously is, the title I wanted to put, So Detroit. Anyone who's lived around Detroit, that area, you'll know what she is. And so she really represents that city well. And obviously I think about the Joe Louis Fist downtown. And so she really embodies when we think about Detroit. But her election, I mean, historic, I mean, in so many ways, obviously, as Stephanie and Laurel said, I mean, she, along with Ilhan Omar, were the first Muslim American women elected to the US Congress. And also, she's the first Palestinian American woman elected to Congress. So we want to look at, in keeping with the theme of the panel, looking at to what extent were Arab Americans, Muslims, and women symbolically empowered by Tlaib's 2018 campaign for Congress. But the biggest thing, and Evelyn was pushed, she's like, how the heck did she win in this majority Black district? I mean, she was replacing an icon, John Conyers Jr. I mean, that's, yeah, when I started digging further, I was like, how the heck did she win? And I better keep track of time too here. Yeah, so how did she win? And so you can see the demographics of the district here, the 13th district, by the way, which is, I keep checking, they said it's the third poorest district in the country. And I think that's accurate based on the census data. But it's 53% Black and only 5.1% Arab American. Now, I say only, that's still one of the largest concentrations of Arab Americans in the country. So, and also in the state of Michigan. I couldn't get a really good number here, so but yeah, it's huge. And so the thing that's interesting, she was running in the primary against John Conyers' son. Well, he announced he actually got eliminated because he didn't get enough people. He didn't have enough signatures to get onto the ballot, so he was eventually eliminated from the ballot by his cousin Ian Conyers. It's crazy. It just gets crazy. And then Conyers actually endorsed his son, but again, he got knocked off the ballot, so he didn't actually run in the primary. She ran against Coleman Young's son was on the ballot, who was the first mayor of Detroit, Black mayor of Detroit. And then she ran against Brenda Jones, who was a well-known long-term 14-year city councilwoman and was actually endorsed by the Democratic Party. Brenda Jones was also endorsed by the mayor at the time, Mike Dugan. So she was running, I mean, she did not have establishment on her side. She was running in a majority Black district. She was running against relatives of well-known icons, but yet she still prevailed. And so you can see here, and it was really funny how this happened. They had the special election to finish out the Conyers seat stayed open for like a year. Which is, I don't know why, but it was open for a year to Republican governor at the time left open for a year. So they had a special election. The governor decided to have a special election to have the full term, the full 2-year term, and then also to finish the last 2 months of Conyers' term. And so it was a very strange election night where Brenda Jones, the establishment, and Brenda Jones is also black woman, an establishment candidate who won the special election for the unexpired, for the last 2 months of his term. She won that, but she lost the primary election to satisfy the 2-year term and to leave only won that by 900 votes. So it was a very, very close election. How did she win? I mean, the theory about this, first of all, is she won because the black candidates didn't coordinate, and that's why she lost the vote. Another one is that she also won because blacks didn't coordinate. And another reason why she possibly won is because she raised so much more money than all the candidates. I mean, I don't have a slide for that, but she raised so much more money, not just from within state, but from out of state. So again, we'll talk about this more, but I want to talk about why did she run for office? She wanted to serve as a check on President Trump. And well, actually, you guys are probably familiar with the quote that she wanted to impeach the MF. And so that's what she became known for. How could she do that? But really, part of a larger theme is to counter attacks on women, minorities, and Muslims. And keeping in, what was interesting, she didn't really pitch her election as historic. She said, I didn't run because my election would be historic. I ran because of the injustices, because of my boys who were questioning their identity, Muslim identity, and whether they belong. I've never been one to stand on the sidelines. So that's one of the reasons why she said she ran. You know, what's interesting, and reading her story and thinking about the dynamics of the district that she's running in, even though she doesn't necessarily downplay her heritage, but she doesn't emphasize it in the primary campaign when she runs in 2018. She did it after she won the primary. Matter of fact, she kept saying, like, during the election, no one cared, it's not about history, it's about trying to win and solve the issues of our district and all the constituents. But when she won the primary, she actually acknowledged the significance and what it means for Palestinians. Am I freezing up here? Okay. So she's like, she says, after the primary victory, she said, I'm going to be a woman, a mom, a Muslimah, a Palestinian, an Arab, and so many of these other layers of these identities, depending on who I am talking to and what they want to identify me as. So again, during the campaign, part of this is probably strategic. She didn't want to necessarily emphasize her heritage, really trying to find these cross-cutting connections with the district. But after the primary, she really started talking about what it meant to be a symbol and what her election meant. And she also recognizes this again after she wins the primary and then the general election, because Detroit's mostly a Democratic district. So winning the primary, that's where all the action is. And so she's at this Muslim public affairs convention, and she says, I want them to see that the strength of me being a Palestinian American, a woman who is the child of immigrants, the eldest of 14, I wasn't going to back down. I wasn't going to sell out, because I've seen the pain in my parents' eyes every time they felt like they were being sold out. And so that is just very much Rashida Tlaib. And I have to say, I don't present this information here, but also in the book chapter, I go and I look at the congressional hearings, and she's doing the same thing. She is taking these agency officials to task. She's just so Detroit. So recognizing the importance, so again, continuing with recognizing her importance and her connection to the Arab American community. She's like, when you see a Palestinian person with your name and face succeed, it shows that government can't ban us from coming into the country, but not from getting elected. Showing people it can be done would be a victory to my family. So she recognizes this. And then she talks about, and then she links this, her Palestinian background, to that of the Black experience, saying that, you know, every time she sees economic oppression against her Black brothers and sisters, the othering and dehumanization of my immigrant neighbors, it reminds me of what my family continues to go through in Palestine. So it's funny, like after election, she really starts digging into what it means and what her victory means and the symbol that she represents. And then I pulled a few quotes from, and again, the data that I used, I'm sorry to not mention it, most of the data I used, I looked newspaper accounts, really trying to get these quotes, no interviews, sorry. But I was able to get a lot of good stuff through newspapers. And so this comes from a reporter from the Arab American News, who basically summarizes what her victory means to the Muslim community, also really getting back, and her whole purpose of running for office to serve as a check on Donald Trump. And another supporter in the district saying how monumental it was to Arab Americans and Palestinians, that she could embrace who she was and who she is, be genuine, and still win a seat. Let me stop sharing that. So just so a couple of things to really kind of bring it. So she's definitely recognizes, and her constituents recognize, the importance of what her victory meant for not just people in Detroit, but also for Muslims across the country. But I think a question that I started thinking about too is that, is this the future of African-American politics? I mean, Tlaib, so she's part of the Justice Democrats, and we know the very progressive group, far to the left, and many of the issues are consistent with issues that Blacks care about. You saw with Richie Torres in, you had several Congress people who ran against either establishment incumbents, and actually many members of the CBC are kind of pissed that some of these candidates are running against incumbents, Black incumbents. And so is this the future? Like Rashida Tlaib said, look, these establishment candidates like Brenda Jones, she's not really speaking to the issues that are really affect African Americans. So will we see more African Americans being challenged? Will it be more about the issues and not necessarily the symbol of just being a minority? So I know my time is up, but thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Really appreciate your presentation as we think about sort of the substantive impact of these symbols. Next up, our final presentation comes from Lori Frazier, Chelsea Jones, or is it Chelsea Jones, and Crystal Robertson from UCLA. The title of their presentation is Mayor London Breed and the Limits of Governing While Black and Female in San Francisco. So the floor is yours.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Crystal Robertson. I am a second-year PhD student at UCLA.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chelsea Jones. I'm a third-year PhD student at UCLA. You're on mute, Lori.
Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. I'm Lori Frazier, Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at UCLA.
Thank you. And we are so excited to present this chapter. We also had a bit of fun writing it, and what we'll be presenting is only a glimpse into the chapter. There'll be much more content covered in the text, so we hope you all will get a chance to read it once it's out. So in 2018, London Breed won a hotly contested mayoral election to become the first Black woman mayor in San Francisco's 200-year history. And so her win was remarkable, not only because she was a historic first, but because she won in a city that's actually majority white and Asian with a declining Black population. And so a lot of us know San Francisco culturally for its storied history of LGBTQ activism and being this political respite for sexually marginalized individuals. And so this makes London Breed's history over an openly gay white male and an Asian woman a case that we thought was deserving investigation as well. So we use a case study approach to answer the question, what factors contributed to the successful mayoral campaign of London Breed in San Francisco? So to inform our theoretical approach, I think we have to start with the context that underlines Breed's campaign prior to her run for office. So her term as mayor actually began in 2017, a year before the election, after the unexpected death of Mayor Ed Lee. And as the current president of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, she was the legal heir to the position. However, her tenure was cut short when her fellow members of the Board of Supervisors argued that she wielded too much power as both president of the board and acting mayor. And so they actually replaced her only a month after taking her position and voted her out of mayor's office, replacing her with this wealthy white male supervisor who was not in the race because they argued that as acting mayor, she could sway the upcoming election, giving herself an incumbency advantage. So some of the articles and reports that captured this event posited that the goal of her removal was actually to subvert her growing influence, but this action increased her favorability among the Black community because Black community members saw her removal from office as this racially motivated attack, and another instance of wealthy white political elites undermining the hard-earned success of Black women. So many Black residents related this action to the historic treatment of the Black community in San Francisco, which they claim was manipulated by rich white men for kind of its history. And so for many Black voters, voting for Breed became this form of resistance against a longstanding history of anti-Black policy decisions.
Right. So given this background, our chapter considers two main theories to assess Breed's victory and expand what we know theoretically about her campaign. The first is that of symbolic empowerment, which considers how a historic first motivates voters to participate in politics through their shared identities, in this case being race. And next, we consider her campaign within the framework of deracialization, as Dr. Wright also mentioned earlier. We know deracialization to be a pragmatic method, typically for male candidates of color, to attract white voters and build multiracial coalitions. Up to this chapter, the literature provided little evidence about how this theory pertains to female candidates of color, an absence we seek to resolve with this project. And so to conduct our case study, we combined three methods. The first and main method being a content analysis, where we placed ourselves in the shoes of critical San Franciscans, reading articles, analyzing her campaign website, videos, and updates, as well as social media posts, not only from Breed, but about her, as well as how other social media users responded to those videos. To further build a contextual background, we use GIS to map the race and income distributions, as well as consider geographic implications associated with vote choice. And we incorporate descriptive statistics with a report from a pre-election poll conducted by Survey USA in San Francisco with a sample of 800 adults.
So as Crystal said, symbolic empowerment asserts that voters are motivated by their shared identities with the candidate. So next, we'll present some of the findings of strategies that her campaign employed to present Breed as this authentic member of San Francisco's Black community. And one of those critical shared identities that her campaign centered was her identification with her hometown, which was San Francisco's historic Black community, the Western Addition. So at its peak, the Western Addition was referred to as Harlem of the West because it was this hub for Black life, Black culture, jazz music, and so much more. And it followed the thread of many American Black communities where it was ravaged by botched urban renewal, demolished infrastructure, and this retraction of city resources from the area. And so this obstruction was kind of followed by institutional promises of this new plan for the community. But instead of delivering on those promises, urban renewal destroyed property, increased poverty among Black San Franciscans in the latter half of the 20th century. And so that income inequality has since been exacerbated by the creation of Silicon Valley. As you see the city's financial gains accelerate with this tech boom, gentrification then prices out the Black community. So we found that the Black population fell from 13% in 1970 to about 5% by the 2018 election that we're analyzing. So we developed this map that you see to visualize this wealth inequality in San Francisco. We use data from the American Community Survey. And so the heart of Western Addition, this neighborhood we're talking about, is outlined in white. And this is showing us that Black residents have a median income close to the poverty line at about $27,000, while white San Franciscans are sitting at about $89,000. So Downs' theory of this rational and economic voting reminds us that voters are using their past economic conditions to kind of evaluate candidates based on what benefits they have or provide. And so when we put this together with this context, we realize that Black residents of the Western Addition and of San Francisco as a whole are looking at their wealth inequality as a result of policy decisions from these previous Democratic leaders. And so these are the conditions that created this need for a political transformation, created this need for Breed and her non-traditional history.
An analysis of Breed's campaign speeches shows that Breed was keenly aware of her ability to address Black voters' historic concerns by appealing to voters with her personal background, having been born and raised in San Francisco's Western Addition. Breed made a habit of beginning her speeches with a reminder that she was raised by her grandmother in public housing in the Western Addition. These narratives of her personal experiences with poverty positioned her as empathetic to San Franciscans struggling financially, a drastic change of pace from San Francisco's legacy of wealthy white politicians. They also became a shortcut for Black and other low-income voters to see themselves as a policy priority for her, as evidenced by the tweets above. And so our inference that Breed appealed to her predominantly Black hometown, the Western Addition, is evidenced by this map of vote choice by neighborhood. The Western Addition is circled in red, and data from Fairview, California reveals the majority of residents in the Western Addition voted for Breed as their first choice candidate. In addition to the appeal specifically to the Western Addition, Breed's connections to Black institutions allowed her to form shared identities with Black religious voters. Breed identifies as a Christian and has been a member of the Third Baptist Church since she was a child. Breed's long-term membership and active engagement garnered her the support of the Black church and its members, as they were some of her strongest advocates opposing her removal from mayoral office, as this quote demonstrates. And so Reverend Brown, a prominent member of the Black community of San Francisco, and Breed supporters saw the removal of Breed not only as bias, but as an attack on the entire San Francisco Black community.
So while London Breed's strategy worked in the Black community, San Francisco's population kind of required her to create a broad multiracial coalition in order to fully garner the win. And so we posit that she used deracialization and a deracialized campaign strategy to do so, kind of mirroring some of the findings that were discussed earlier with the Gillum campaign. So in 2017, the year before the election, San Francisco's population of voting age citizens was 41% white, 34% Asian, 15% Latino, and only 5% Black. And so because of this, Breed's campaign had to develop a policy agenda that appealed to both a white and an Asian audience while still maintaining her base of Black voters. And so political science literature has emphasized deracialization as this method for largely male candidates of color to attract white voters in majority white jurisdictions. But Breed is breaking this tradition as a female candidate vying for the support of a diverse population. So while her storytelling of her childhood is this implicit connection to Black voters, our content analysis revealed that largely on the campaign trail, Breed was discussing her racialized background in very race-neutral terms, rarely connecting some of the issues that she faced back to policies that were rooted in racism. And so we claim that she does what Christopher Stout calls making positive racial appeals. This is demonstrating her efforts to advance Black policy interests, but without attacking outside institutions. And so one example that we use to discuss this is her relationship to the African American Art and Culture Complex, which she was formerly executive director of before fully pursuing her political career. And so she often uses her accomplishments there as a talking point on the campaign trail. But instead of discussing benefits specifically to the Black community, she juxtaposes her improvement of this complex as this microcosm of change that she wants to make on behalf of all San Franciscans in the entire city. And so in this quote above, she's talking about it to a newspaper, and she discusses the physical improvements to the center, noting that this is what I want San Francisco to be, an amazing place where the bathrooms look great, the sidewalks look great, the bus stop looks great, where you don't see glass all over the streets. However, omitted from this discussion is a commentary on the conditions that created the need for such improvements, and even the policies that may have sustained the complex's underdevelopment prior to her coming and making these improvements. So ultimately, her discussion around any racially pointed subject while she's on the campaign trail kind of almost always tilts back to this racially transcendent policy agenda.
Our case study posits that London Breed's avoidance of racially divisive issues ultimately shaped her policy agenda. The issues she centers on, homelessness, housing equity, and public safety, each address pressing and historical issues for San Francisco while carrying no explicit racial leaning, as opposed to race-specific issues such as San Francisco's stance as a sanctuary city or the displacement of Black residents through rapid gentrification. Data from Survey USA further exemplifies how voters responded to such appeals. Breed supporters demonstrate high regard for race-neutral issues such as housing at 36% and homelessness at 29%, indicating a purposeful implementation of a deracialized agenda in the Breed campaign. Turning to her competitors, Breed's deracialized strategy was particularly important in light of her candidacy against two other potential historic firsts, with Kim as the first Asian American woman mayor and Leno as the first openly gay mayor. In our chapter, we consider how each candidate's supporters shaped their issue orientation and approach to racial issues. We found that Jane Kim's supporters were largely concerned about crime and city gentrification, heavily racialized issues that Breed only discussed in race-neutral terms. Her deracialized strategy was critical in light of candidate alliances between Kim and Leno. By partnering their multiracial but largely white supporters, Breed was challenged to capture a similar but larger coalition. And then turning to Breed's tenure as mayor and transitioning into her style of governing, specifically how she pivoted from a race-neutral campaign to a race-specific response to the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests. As police departments fall under the purview of city and state governments, mayoral responses to these protests are of crucial importance to consider. San Francisco's police department had already implemented many of the suggestions around police use of force that programs such as 8 Can't Wait recommended prior to Breed becoming mayor. And given that many of these policies were already in place, she could have distanced herself from the racial nature of these protests, but instead chose to emphasize her racial identity and personal experience with police killings, having a cousin of hers killed by a police officer. Breed presented her plan for police reform, including reallocating the city's budget from funding police toward projects investing in marginalized communities, predominantly Black communities.
So in conclusion, our case study found Breed's symbolism as a Black candidate from public housing, raised by her grandmother. This was reflective of San Francisco's ability to overcome this history of systemic racism and oppressive economic policies. And so her identification with the Western Addition signaled to Black voters that she was representing their interests, and it motivated them to support her candidacy. But even though she found success in inspiring the Black community, San Francisco's diversity required that she create a multiracial coalition. And so she built that coalition through a deracialized campaign strategy, speaking about racial minority issues in universal terms, and choosing policy items that did not directly target the African-American population, even if they did have a beneficial impact to the group. And so some critics might charge that she ran from race for political issues, and supporters might actually argue that this was a pragmatic approach towards success at the ballot box to then later embrace her Blackness when it was most critical. Ultimately, her tactics allow her to garner the win and become the first Black woman mayor in San Francisco. And we plan to continue analyzing her transition and strategy from this electoral coalition to that of a governing coalition. So thank you all so much for your time. We look forward to your questions and feedback.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Really, I feel so drawn in and fascinated by each chapter, each candidate, and their campaign. I feel like I learned so much about politics. As a political scientist, I still benefit from learning about individual campaigns, electoral candidates, and how deracialization as a concept continues to travel, be tweaked, manipulated, and used in this particular case, alongside the construct of symbolic empowerment. So thank you all, each and every one of you, for contributing to the book. As you all are aware, fingers crossed, Rutledge will be the press. So At this time, I'd like to open it up to the audience. I'm sure you have questions that you'd like answered. So feel free to either open your mic or write something in the chat at this time. But again, truly amazing job, great research, and I can't thank you enough for your contributions. So who has a question from our audience?
I was going to ask a question of some of our fellow panelists. I know Dr. Sharon Wright Austin spoke a little bit about party support and Andrew Gillum, and I was just wondering. I find this, all the candidates that we focused on, all the historic firsts were, of course, Democrats. But I'm just really curious, and the Democratic Party likes to, tout how diverse it is, but I just feel like there's been research by Dow and Brown and many people on this panel in this forum, that the Democratic Party really doesn't deserve much credit for these historic firsts. And I was just wondering if anyone else had any insights from their research about the support or lack of support of the Democratic Party in the success of these historic firsts.
May I? I'm sorry. I just wanted to say, Laurel, it's nice to meet you, and I loved hearing your presentation with your team. But I love the fact that you underscored the role of the Democratic Party, or the lack of the role of the Democratic Party. And one of the things that we may consider is the role of the bandwagon effect. And we saw that in 2008 with Barack Obama running against Hillary Clinton, and really the slow roll towards the bandwagon effect towards Barack Obama. And so this is not just indicative of these elections that we're studying here, but the role of the bandwagon effect and how we study that construct as political scientists and might apply it to the Democratic Party, and its strengths and weaknesses, and how it can affect especially women of color running for office because of the intersections of factors related to their inability to raise money, all of the things that we think about that Peta, Diane, other folks have studied for a long time about why women of color don't run for office or why they may not be successful. But if you're waiting for the Democratic Party to show up for you, right, that's slowing down your ability to raise the kinds of funds that you need to be successful. So I really appreciate you bringing that to the fore, but a theoretical construct to couch that within might be the role of the bandwagon effect.
I just had a question. I had a comment and then a question. But to respond to your comment about the Democratic Party, I think what we saw with Andrew Gillum in 2018, and what we've seen even since then in like 2020 with the two Senate elections in Georgia, is that I don't think candidates are waiting for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party to help them. I think they're just coming up with their own grassroots campaign. And I think what Gilliam did was he mobilized a lot of young voters, a lot of progressive voters, and that's the same tactic that they used in Georgia, not only for John Ossoff and for Raphael Warnock, but also to flip Georgia from being a red state to now a purple state in favor of Joe Biden. And so I think that a lot of, historically, the political parties have not really been supportive of underdog candidates. And so these candidates have had to look elsewhere. They haven't had a lot of money. They haven't had a lot of name recognition. So they put together these grassroots campaigns, and they just went out and just talked to the people. And I think that's what Gillum did. And we even saw even more recently, that's what candidates did in 2020. But I had a question for the ladies from UCLA who did such a fantastic job about London Breed, because my research also looks at Black female mayors. And one of the things that I'm noticing with the women that are in my book is that they mostly focus on their race, and they don't really focus on their gender. And they, they have to deal with like racism, but you don't really see a lot of blatant evidence of sexism. That's not to say that it doesn't exist, but when people attack these women, they attack them because they're Black, not necessarily because they're women. So with London Breed, with her campaign, Did you see any evidence of sexism, of anyone directing anything against her that was sexist? And then also, I guess, what role did her gender play? Did she get the support of women's organizations? And so that's my question.
I love that. Thanks, Sharon. Go ahead, Sharon.
I can jump in on this one because that actually wasn't something we got a chance to talk about, but it was actually, we would consider part of her deracialized strategy to focus on her gender. And so a lot of times you see when people ask her questions about the kind of historic importance of her run for the Black community, she'll shift it back to young girls. So a lot of times she shifts all the questions back to the importance to the youth. It's important for young girls to see themselves become mayors. I have these, even when she went to go file for her candidacy, she brought a group of young girls of different races with her. And so we think it kind of falls into this concept of promoting non-threatening images to kind of couch herself within the youth, to say, you know, these are the people I'm trying to inspire, not necessarily the Black community. And she never really says Black girls even, she always says young girls. And so in her second run for mayor, there were actually some more sexist attacks on her. So we didn't go as deep into that, but there was a billboard made of her where she's kind of sitting up in a couch with her legs up, smoking a cigar, kind of to reference how people believe she's spending the city's money. So that's where you kind of see the sexism start to play out as she's running again for re-election.
Great question, Sharon. As you know, in my own work, when I talk about Shirley Chisholm, I talk about her as having faced racism, sexism, and misogyny. And we've seen this come up in the case of Kamala Harris's run for Vice President of the United States. But great question. And as you all have probably read, the reviews of the book kind of push us in some of these cases to consider candidates like London Breed and others through a very intersectional lens, not strictly in terms of their racial identity, but race times gender, and in other cases, ethnic background or religious affiliation. So I want to bring Payte Lynn in because earlier I saw her hand up, so I don't want to, overlook you.
Oh, thank you. Actually, thank you, everybody. I really enjoy everybody's presentation. But actually, I was indeed going to ask the question that Sharon already asked, is indeed what's, actually, I was focused not only on gender, but also actually on the organizations, such as Amnesty List and others that seem to play a very important role for progressive women. But then there's also the Republican side. They also, such as now we have two, Korean and actually, two Republican women elected into immigrant women elected in Congress, and that can actually be attributed to not only the partisan, but also other non-partisan groups support. And so that was just a brief comment. Thank you.
I think we've got time for one more.
Yeah, Neil has her hand.
Hi, hold on, let me unmute myself. Hi, everyone. Thank you for this set of papers. This was great. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about maybe what we might take away broadly about kind of limitations or perhaps diminishing limitations for minority candidates or Black and Brown candidates as far as racialization is concerned, because I think with the exception of the presentation on London Breed, I hear a lot of people saying this person could be their genuine self. This person could talk more openly about their identity. And that has not always been the case for, minority candidates. And I think, particularly for Gillum, I was living in Miami when Gillum ran, and I remember him, sending out mailings about, the effect on Black folks, from mass incarceration. I mean, he went, I think, a step further than, statewide candidates have gone, in the past. I remember the debate, at the end, he says, the only thing I have to do is stay Black, right? And I mean, that to me was like, what did he say? And so I think, for me, Gillum represented somebody that really was kind of bucking the trend as far as, deracializing. But then we also have these candidates like London Breed. And so I'm just wondering kind of what are the the broader theories that we can take from all of these examples, and is it becoming easier for minority candidates to really kind of talk about race more openly? Sorry, that was long-winded there.
If I may, I was actually wonder, have you read Christine Collett's book? Actually, it was a POP article that talks about that, there were three kinds of campaign. There was, of course, for minority candidate, that's certainly one is deracialized, right? The other is biracial. And the third is actually called toggling. Right, that is actually you micro-targeting your messages to different communities, to different organizations, to different communities. You actually then adjust your messages using the different media outlet also in order to reach actually to bring those diverse group come into your camp. So it's kind of a differences according to the different community or identity and the context. And so that is not just about either or, race or not.
Can you reference that article again? The author said it was Public Opinion Quarterly.
No, it's a perspective of politics.
Perspectives.
And the last name is Christine Collet, Collet.
Okay, I'll look for that. Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time and it's now 1:46. I thank you all for attending today's panel. It's great to see everybody's face in this forum, in this venue. I'm looking at, my colleague from Purdue here and all of you. So hopefully we will meet once again in the future, but that time it'd be in person, right? So still, it was a pleasure. I'm glad everyone was able to participate and be present. And of course, we could probably talk about this topic for hours. So my apologies that it has to come to an end. But again, I thank you all for attending, asking really interesting questions, and to all of the contributors making such an intellectual addition and adding such value to the construct and the book itself. I will be in touch as we move forward in the next phase of the project. But again, thank you all for both attending, participating, being here, and offering up some very thoughtful questions for the panelists. So enjoy the rest of your day and the conference. Much love.